Perfect.
Actually.
All right, thank you very much for coming back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and are all ready for our second expert panel. You may have noticed I have switched places and put on my moderator's hat for this one, which looks, as the title says, on alignment trends in Indo-Pacific security, which may sound a little bit broad, but we talked a lot this morning about adversarial or oppositional alignments that really define international relations recently and will probably or certainly define international relations in the years to come, with the so-called axis of upheaval on the one hand and whatever we want to call the status quo power, US-led or not, like-minded partners on the other. However stable these alignments and groupings may be, we know they are here to stay. What we also know is that the US-China rivalry is at the is the cornerstone of these alignments. And we also know is that with the arrival of the second Trump presidency, it is likely going to intensify. And if I may add, I think there are also solid chances that with the United States going more America first or going more inwards, chances are that China will double down on going outwards, will double down on trying to seduce all the powers that may be on Victor Cha's red risk, which is a lot. So this is a trend that is extremely worrying, and I'm not only referring to the Russia, China, DPRK, Iran alignment, but slightly beyond. And let's not call it the global south or putting any labels, but of course the BRICS gathering has attracted some attention lately, and there are many formations that may be put forward. And it's true that China is already doing it through trade, through diplomatic engagement. We see it in Southeast Asia, we see it in Africa, we see it in Latin America. So the point of this session was to put the spotlight on the regional actors, and the real Indo-Pacific actors. Sorry, Sarah, you're standing out here. And to see what are the reactions. Now, Minister Braje this morning said that countries do not need to choose. Of course, that is a fact, but it's perhaps easier said than done, and they definitely adapt, they adjust their foreign security policies, and they try to navigate this as best as they can. So I'm delighted to welcome here with me a stellar panel, as usual. And I'll start with my left. I'll start how they are presented on the program, which is also the alphabetical order, so that no one feels offended. Professor Alice Ba is a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Delaware, and is also one of the most renowned experts on Southeast Asia, on ASEAN. Spoiler, I've been quoting you for as long as I've been looking in this region, so you're throughout my PhD thesis as well. Thank you so much for making that trip. Dr. Sarah Kirchberger, our very own in a sense that she's a European, she's German, currently director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy and Security Center at the University of Kiel. But Sarah has been one of the pioneer voices also on the Russia-China relations way before, I want to say it was in vogue, but really before we talked or we could talk about the current alignment. Then the third, Ambassador Saurabh Kumar, the ambassador of India to the Kingdom of Belgium, Luxembourg, and the European Union, who is not only an ambassador, but also has a distinguished career, of course, in countries such as Iran, Myanmar, and China. He was posted in China, so also an expertise and experience with dealing with these countries. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Caroline Millar, who has been joined us for all the three, actually, editions. You're the only speaker who we had in all the three editions. Thank you so much. The Ambassador of Australia to the EU, NATO, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And here again, a distinguished expert on international security, because in her previous serving, she was Deputy Secretary of National Security and International Policy in the Prime Minister's Office of Australia, and among other, also a Sherpa of the Quad Leaders Summit. So I'm truly, truly pleased to be here, and I will start with Sarah.
Oh, okay.
You who have been looking at the China-Russia relationship, as we said, for a long time. We keep saying it's a tip of an iceberg. We keep saying, some say it's a marriage of convenience. We've kind of went beyond this debate, I think. We say there's more to come or less to come. It keeps surprising us. And yet we all say that we kind of expected it because we talk about it for a long time. So how would you assess the quality of this relationship going forward? And what is the appeal of this duo, or even more this kind of revisionist rhetoric to all those countries in between? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for having me here. It's a great honor to be on this conference and sharing some ideas from an, you could say, scholarly expert perspective. Oh, I'm sorry for that. Is it better now? No. Okay. You're right, Eva. Russia-China military technical cooperation has been my long-term research focus, actually. I've looked back, I think, 10 years now, coming from the naval perspective first and then looking at different other aspects. And I have to say, I'm sorry for the mic, so if somebody can hand me a hand mic, I will gladly accept it. Looking at the development, I have some ideas on the trajectory, on the status that we're in, and also what it might mean for other powers. So let me, thank you. Yeah, okay. Is it all right? Fantastic. So just yesterday, our German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, was in China, and she gave a solo press conference because her counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, had refused to join her. And she said something interesting. She said, drones from Chinese factories and North Korean troops that attack peace in the middle of Europe violate our European core security interests. That's an adaptation from the Chinese language that you often hear about Chinese core interests. And in the Chinese readout later of the talks between them, the Chinese side said it is necessary for Germany to correct its strategic cognition. So there was something wrong apparently with our minister's strategic cognition. I would say that our foreign minister is actually very correct. China has been labeled by NATO as a key enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine for very good reason, for empirical facts that are on the ground. And like others before her, our minister has tried apparently very hard, but without much success, to dissuade China from its way of supporting the war against Ukraine and to use its clout to stop Russia from engaging in this war. China, by the way, also has a lot of clout over North Korea. One could say North Korea hangs on the drip of the saline drip of China, economically at least. So if China really were not on board with North Korean soldiers being sent to the front line by Russia, I think they could stop it any day they wanted. But clearly they aren't. So why is China behaving in such a way? And I think one aspect that really is missed in a lot of the debate and completely underappreciated to evaluate what the Chinese are doing here and why they're doing it is really the relationship that China has with Ukraine. People never look at that for some reason. But China has very, very heavy obligations towards Ukraine, not just from the Budapest Memorandum that everyone knows about. No, it has a valid friendship and cooperation treaty with Ukraine that was concluded in 2013 for 25 years and signed by Xi Jinping himself. And this treaty contains actually very strong security guarantees that surpass what is in the text of the Budapest Memorandum. I can only encourage everyone to read the text of that treaty. So revealing how China has actually failed in its duties towards Ukraine when it came under threat by Russia is really instructive and should also be something that the countries of the so-called global south might be interested in studying in terms of evaluating what kind of a partnership China is offering them. But at the very least, one can say the existence of this treaty and the fact that it constrains to some degree what China can do to support Russia is the one reason, probably, why China has not fully thrown its support behind Russia in this war. If China did that, that would of course cause major, major problems for the front lines in Ukraine. And just to illustrate to you why China concluded this treaty with Ukraine, what does China owe to Ukraine? It's a huge debt of gratitude. The treaty was the result of a history of very intense Ukrainian-Chinese military technology transfers until 2014, I have to add, that gave China access to very critical technologies that China could not have obtained from anywhere else, including an aircraft carrier hull, a carrier-based fighter jet, pilot training infrastructures, naval gas turbines for powering large warships, and phased array radar technology, which you need to defend the airspace around the carrier, among other things. So if you just subtract all of that, where would China's military be today? My estimate as a naval analyst is China would not be able to field even a single operational carrier strike group today if it would have had to develop all of these things by itself. So coming back again to the countries from the global south, if China, who gained so much from Ukraine, a country that was always loyal to China also, throws Ukraine overboard the minute it comes under an existential threat, what hope can any other countries have of being supported by China in a similar situation? That is a question I would ask the countries that argue that China is a better partner than the countries of the West. Rather than offering Ukraine assistance, China has parroted Kremlin propaganda, blamed NATO, and so on and so on. So it's a fact that China, like Russia, is more like a transactional type of partner. So these alignments between countries like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they are of course transactional. But this is not a problem for them because trust and values are not what unites such countries. They know exactly what to expect from each other. And security in your expectations creates its own type of trust. This is actually also trust, if you can trust your partner to behave in this or that way. So as long as interests align and as they have something material to gain from the cooperation, there is a valid incentive to continue doing that. So the benefit for China of this war, if it had gone the way that Putin originally planned it, would have been a bolstered Russia, a diminished West, and Ukraine would have turned into something akin to Belarus, coming back to the situation that China would find more beneficial for its own interest. China is probably not happy about the brutality against Ukrainian civilians, the destruction and the mess that this war has created. And the Prigozhin rebellion, I believe, last year, really shocked Beijing and caused this massive purge in the Chinese military that we have been observing ever since, with even the Minister of Defense and very high-ranking officials being purged, probably due to questions about their loyalty to Xi Jinping. So this is the situation, I believe, between Russia and China right now. It is, they are united as like-minded countries, one could say, by having very similar goals and having powerful synergies between them. They are just opposed to the hegemonic power of the United States and the world order it has created, and they want to reserve for themselves the right to go to war if it suits them, if they can accomplish their political goals by that. And there's the key difference, and this makes it just similar to North Korea and Iran and such actors, and this is the alliance that we are looking at. So we have to look this unsavory reality firmly in the eye and not kid ourselves as to the nature of this cooperation. We are headed for certain to a new type of Cold War, but that's at least better than a hot war that could be even larger than the one that we're seeing now. So I'm rooting for the Cold War, actually. we have to watch what we do. Our reactions to the Russian nuclear blackmail in particular is very concerning. It teaches China that this could be a viable way to fend off outside support if you resort to war to reach your political goals. Let me conclude with one thought for our allies in the United States and the question that was earlier mentioned about the value of allies. I would argue that the value of allies is a bit underrated in the sense that they can actually provide you vital intelligence, vital information that avoids strategic miscalculation. If you talk to the frontline countries, those that have actually been engaged in conflict with the powers that we're faced with, they understand the nature of the challenge better than anyone. So in Asia, that would be Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, for instance, countries that have experienced the brutal, side of these powers. And in Europe, that would be, of course, Ukraine right now, but also Finland, the Baltics, Poland, Czech Republic, and so on. Countries that have first-hand experience of the nature of this challenge. So frustration with some of the non-frontline countries like Germany and France and so on should not, lead Americans to the conclusion that allies have no value. I believe it's exact opposite. And one could maybe argue that the Biden administration, the outgoing one, has made a few miscalculations in terms of understanding the strategic challenges we're right now faced with. And a lot of that comes, I believe, from illusions, from not looking reality in the eye when it comes to the nature of how the Russian and maybe also the Chinese regimes operate. So that's some thoughts on that front. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sarah. Nonetheless, at least to make us think that a Cold War is actually a good thing. I think we just have to adjust our cognitive minds with a strategic cognition in that sense. So I guess we are adjusting now to this new mindset. No, a lot of valuable thoughts. I wonder to what extent the Ukraine-China relationship is actually known to most actors. I think it's still a niche information, but perhaps we should talk about it a little bit more also to point out on the trustworthiness of this partner. Allow me now to turn to perhaps, well, I wouldn't say the most important, one of the most important, of course, countries in the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador, India stands out on many ways, and historically have always done so. It's one of the leaders, if you can be a leader of an unaligned movement. It has been trying to adjust its foreign policy significantly. And it's, of course, one of the front lines of this great power competition. It is geographically in the middle. It has its own problems, a lot of its own problems. It's a democracy that we love to work with. How would you describe the situation from New Delhi? What are the main challenges, and where do you position India in the future?
So thank you very much, Dr. Pejsova. What I would do is I would talk about the Indo-Pacific from India's perspective. I think I would touch upon Russia, Ukraine, India, Russia relationship, and then give some thoughts on EU and the Indo-Pacific, if that is fine. So Indo-Pacific, of course, is hugely critical for India from geopolitical and geoeconomic perspective. That goes without saying. Our vision is for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. We would like to see respect for international law, particularly UNCLOS, and freedom of navigation and unimpeded trade in the region, and respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. We have a coastline of 7,500 kilometers plus. Our trade depends upon security of sea lines of communication, so that makes Indo-Pacific all the more critical for us. I would make a brief reference to 3 institutions and initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. Of course, some of these predate the construct of the Indo-Pacific. First is ASEAN, because ASEAN has not been mentioned, and I suppose our Australian ambassador would also talk about it. I think recognition of the pivotal role of ASEAN is critical in our vision of the Indo-Pacific. Its centrality is very important, and we attach a lot of importance to the ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The second initiative I would talk about is the Quad, and I think that fits into the topic of the seminar today. We are working with our partners, the United States, Japan, and Australia, within the framework of the Quad. There was some discussion in the earlier panel about these institutions, how they would fare under the new US administration. It has to be kept in mind that it was under Mr. Trump's last tenure that the Quad was revived at the official level, and then it was raised to the summit level during the Biden administration. So Quad has taken a lot of initiatives. They have been, as I just mentioned, the foreign ministers meet and then the summit level meeting takes place. Ambassador here was the Sherpa for Quad. She can speak more about it. But the essential objective is to provide options to countries of the region so that the dependencies are less, particularly for the smaller countries. Maritime domain awareness, which is critical in the maritime area, I think that has been another initiative which has come out of the Quad. And just to digress a little bit, we are cooperating with the United States within the framework of the IPEF in the area of reliable and resilient supply chains. Lastly, our Prime Minister announced in 2019 during the ASEAN summits the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. It has several pillars, and several partner countries have joined these pillars, and we are looking forward to EU taking the responsibility of one of the pillars. And I would just very briefly mention the pillars. These are maritime security, ecology, resources, capacity building, disaster risk reduction, science and technology, and academic cooperation, and trade and connectivity. So it covers a lot of areas and gives a good basket for cooperation. Lastly, as far as Indo-Pacific part of my presentation is concerned, let me say that Indo-Pacific is at the heart of multipolarity and rebalancing, which we are seeing today. It is essential that greater power and capabilities lead to responsibility and restraint. It means economics free from coercion, and politics free of threat or use of force. Let me very briefly touch upon Russia-Ukraine and India-Russia relationship. Our ties with Russia definitely take into account our relationship with our neighbor, and our ties with Russia, give a geopolitical balance in that sense. Historically, our relationship with Russia has been trouble-free. Our defense inventory still remains predominantly of Russian origin, though, for quite some time now, the diversification process is underway. On Russia-Ukraine, our position is that differences between countries cannot be resolved through war. Solution will not emerge from the battlefield. Continuation of conflict risks serious dangers and escalations, and there is need for diplomacy and dialogue. We, of course, as you all know, have been in touch with both the countries. Recently, during the G7 in Italy, Prime Minister had a meeting with President Zelensky, and then during the General Assembly, he again met President Zelensky, and in between, he had visited Moscow for a meeting with President Putin, and at different levels, at the levels of Foreign Minister, National Security Advisor, channels of communication have been kept open. Very briefly, a couple of points on EU and the Indo-Pacific. We believe that EU has major stakes in and leverage on developments in Indo-Pacific. It has economic heft and stakes in many areas, particularly technology, connectivity, trade, and finance. The issues or challenges which emanate from Indo-Pacific reflect problems of the established model of globalization. How to respond to non-market economics is one of the biggest challenges which we have. Problems of economic concentration in some geographies and need for diversification are more clear than ever before. EU and the world will be better off with additional drivers and productions and growth centers. These drivers can help in de-risking and contribute to building reliable and resilient supply chains and promoting trust and transparency in the digital domain. Europe is strategically aware. I think we had an interesting first panel, the high-level panel today. Its actions, however, need to be limited, need not be limited geographically. We spoke about distances and how they impact on perceptions. Indo-Pacific's complexities require more intensive engagement. India, as a political democracy, market economy, and pluralistic society, looks forward to deepening its engagement with the European Union. An approach of pragmatism which factors in economic asymmetries and structural differences is perhaps needed. EU can contribute to economic development, infrastructure, connectivity, energy, and digital transformations besides security. Its global gateway is welcomed by us. Let me conclude by saying that EU and India seek a multipolar world order, and the latter would not be possible, and latter would be possible only if there is a multipolar Asia. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We get that India is definitely one of the poles of this multipolar Indo-Pacific and the world, and it would be great to see, or I may follow up afterwards with a question, to what extent has New Delhi perhaps tried to discuss also Ukraine with Moscow? We keep talking about China's leverage over Moscow. Perhaps we should also look to India to play some sort of I don't want to say a mediating role, but some sort of role in this conflict. You mentioned that we did not mention ASEAN, so I'll try to correct it immediately. Of course, Southeast Asia is in the spotlight for many things, and we wanted to have more discussions on Southeast Asia within this format, but I'm at least glad to have Alice here to tell us the view from Southeast Asia. And I feel terrible for saying a view from Southeast Asia, where we talk about millions of people and 11 nations of ASEAN. We know how incredibly diverse and rich this region is, but it is also geographically, physically, the connector of the Indo-Pacific, right? It is at the center, and it has so much, historical, political, demographic ties to China, and at the same time, a lot of problems with China. So terrible as it sounds to summarize this in less than 10 minutes, if you could just give us a bit of a view.
I will try my best. Thank you very much, Eva. So I am going to focus on some perspectives from Southeast Asia. I will focus on some of the areas that I see to be commonalities, although there will be some sources of difference as well. If I may, I just want to start with a few quick points as a way to think about some of these trends that we're seeing from the region. In some critical ways, Southeast Asia is not like the rest, right, in terms of what we've been hearing this morning. First, there's no doubt, as been mentioned, that Southeast Asia is kind of in this critical geographic space and political space, in facing intensified pressures from the US-China dynamic, although those pressures are also different from some others. As those of us familiar with Southeast Asia know, one of the most recurrent messages that we hear from the region coming these last few years is, don't make us choose. In other words, the rejection of the forced choice. The concern reflects more than one regional anxiety, and so I want to kind of mention those a little bit. The first anxiety is about Southeast Asia unity, which is about ASEAN's own intra-regional dynamics, and relatedly, regional level anxiety about marginalization. Marginalization concerns are captured in the concern and references to, quote, ASEAN centrality. And these concerns are often directed at the new non-ASEAN-focused minilaterals. But this is also more than about positionality of ASEAN itself. So it's more than just about institutional positionality. But again, it is about ensuring that Southeast Asian concerns are also heard and represented. And so and then finally, the message of don't make us choose also reflects national level anxieties about development and political stability. And this leads to a second point that I want to make here, that is that as large as the US-China dynamic is, it's nevertheless bears remembering that individual state decisions and choices may be dictated and constrained more by local governance challenges and domestic regime imperatives. And this is, of course, also where some of the differences lie in terms of Southeast Asian states. And what that also means is economic imperatives. Economics, I'd argue, is important to understanding how some of these multilateral developments are trending. Right? So earlier this morning, someone mentioned the Philippines. I want to just simply say that the Philippines is in some critical ways not like the other 9 or 10. And then a final contextual point that I'll start off with is that Southeast Asian conditions do, include a range of other actors, and there's a strong interest in multipolarization, just as it was mentioned in the India case. In ASEAN, multilateralism serves multipolarization in that it proactively engages these other larger actors actually into the region. And so in that sense, there's some, I think, difference between ASEAN and some of the other, whether it's India or the EU, and their common interest in multipolarization. Because for ASEAN, multipolarization is also about bringing in these other actors of consequence. What else? And so multilateralism, I think we can see in Southeast Asia's case, given these geopolitical conditions, can be seen as a corrective to a US-China binary that makes those two powers the only actors of relevance. This said, US-China competition does matter. They are the biggest kids fighting for turf. And so let me just highlight a few challenges at the ASEAN level. The first is inclusivity, right? ASEAN's value, as well as its challenge, is inclusivity. Malaysia, as the incoming ASEAN chair, has already identified inclusivity as one of the themes of its chairmanship. On the one hand, ASEAN inclusiveness serves two very important interests. One, an interest in not leaving any ASEAN member behind. Again, this gets at the intra-regional concerns and anxieties within ASEAN itself. The importance of intra-ASEAN relations is also an ongoing challenge in the Myanmar crisis, as well as the South China Sea challenges. Malaysia, as incoming ASEAN chair, has made both those issues as a priority as well, although I should also note that Malaysia also has some differences with some other states. And so even though it's generally considered entering in a strong, coming from a stronger position as chair compared to, for example, its predecessor, Laos, it'll be interesting also to see how Malaysia handles some of that consensus-making process. Inclusivity also serves a second interest, and that is ASEAN's interest in neutrality. Right? Neutrality means not favoring one power over another. It was mentioned earlier, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. This was an Indonesian-pushed initiative. And this was really very much about offering a third or alternative vision to the Indo-Pacific. Right? So it's both and, not either or, and it also means diffusing power of the most powerful ones by, again, bringing in other actors. The challenge of inclusivity, because it is, again, there are also challenges to inclusivity, is that that includes a wider range of actors, and of course sources of dissatisfaction amongst actors that may be less vested in ASEAN itself. And so the second challenge that we might also emphasize here in terms of ASEAN is that is sustained attention from external powers. Questions about U.S. commitment and engagements will be especially paramount. These questions are far from new. U.S. has historically been impatient with ASEAN processes, but I think we can all agree that the Trump administration will likely intensify those questions. And then finally, I do want to say something about the economics. I think we haven't said enough about them. There are different kinds of economic uncertainties from the Southeast Asian side associated with the US and China. In the case of the United States, the uncertainties especially regard US protectionist and inward turns and its political inability to negotiate market access economic agreements. And meanwhile, of course, China uncertainties are also interdependent with the US economic questions. You know, US pressures and tensions creates incentives on the parts of both China and Southeast Asia to expand cooperation with one another on the economic front. But that does increase, of course, also possibilities of leverage and influence in Southeast Asia by China. And then finally, my last point, while the challenges to economics and to ASEAN frameworks like the East Asia Summit are not insignificant, I do see smaller and larger opportunities, multilateral opportunities in Asia to stabilize relations and expand cooperation. And again, I'm thinking here mostly in terms of what I see coming from the Southeast Asian side. This would also help assure a kind of ASEAN centrality, and what I mean by that, again, is ASEAN serving as a kind of connector or building block between different arrangements. The larger opportunities are in economics. I think RCEP, if we think about RCEP and the mobilization for RCEP, the last Trump round, right? Those pressures from the US, global uncertainties, help mobilize the conclusion of RCEP. CPTPP, even though not an ASEAN initiative, I think also opens up potential opportunities in the same way. And then finally, just because I know we're out of time, is that I think there's also smaller ways to also build upon this as building blocks among states that might not otherwise be able to cooperate in a larger framework, but then rationalize them into a larger one. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Alice. I'm not going to try to summarize what you said. I've taken I've taken a lot of notes, and at some point I was like, okay, well, anxiety, it's complicated. You may have noticed that I was going geographically kind of southeast, which nicely allows me to end up in Australia. Ambassador, clearly Australia is not exactly a non-aligned country, is not exactly squeezed, has chosen its camp from the very beginning. That doesn't mean it doesn't have issues. And one of the, and you will know more than anyone, one of the kind of dilemmas of Australians' foreign policy is to what extent be part of Asia, while at the same time not being politically that much part of Asia. So how do you see the Australian foreign policy perhaps in the next, I wouldn't bring it all to Trump, but in the next couple of years, let's say?
Well, look, thank you very much. I'm not sure I would characterise it quite that way, actually, but let me just talk a bit about alignment, which is the topic of this whole seminar. And we've talked a lot about this new era of strategic competition and how it's reshaping the Indo-Pacific and indeed the world, and including particularly the accelerating military build-up, rising tensions, and greatly reduced warning time for conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And for Australia, dealing with these dynamics means we need to work with partners in the region and elsewhere to exercise agency to determine the kind of region we want. So I guess we really look up at the region. We don't sort of, the dichotomy that you put at the beginning, I don't think that's one that we would really kind of characterise that way. What we want, as Foreign Minister Wong has often stated, is a peaceful, stable and prosperous region, respectful of sovereignty, and where disputes are addressed in accordance with international law and norms. And there I think we share a great deal with countries in the region. It's why we continue to prioritise our strong alliance with the United States, which I think is what you were alluding to at the beginning, why we work to uphold the rules, and why we engage in deep partnerships with the region. And I'll touch on all of these. To give you a sense of how different things look from where we live, I recently took a group of NATO ambassadors to Australia, who are keen to understand what the Indo-Pacific and global security looked like from our perspective and how we sought to shape it. And for many it was an eye-opener. And that's not entirely surprising if you think about it. Our strategic geography and strategic architecture are strikingly different. In Europe, NATO allies and EU member states are in close geographic proximity with their security and prosperity bound up in two big institutions, the EU and NATO. And NATO operates on the principle of collective defence under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. In the Indo-Pacific, geography is far more fragmented. Distances between close partners like Australia and Japan or Australia and India are enormous by European standards, and the regional architecture is far more complex. NATO-style collective defence doesn't exist. Formal alliance relationships, like Australia's vital alliance with the United States under the ANZUS Treaty, are bilateral. Japan, Thailand and the Philippines also have bilateral alliances with the United States. But rather than relying on large overarching institutions, Australia, like others, participates in a web of bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral, minilateral and multilateral institutions with regional and other partners. So on the theme of today's dialogue, alignment in the Indo-Pacific is more complex and more multifaceted. And for Australia, we're very much focused on economic relationships and political relationships as well as security. They all contribute to regional balance. With respect to this panel's topic of attenuating the effects of great power competition, I'd say a couple of things. First, dealing with great powers is, of course, essential. I've mentioned our alliance with the United States, and I'll come back to that. Much has been said about China and strategic competition, and that is hugely consequential for all of us. And it's why the Australian government has made consistent and successful efforts to stabilise and restore dialogue in the China relationship and have trade restrictions lifted. And many of you will be familiar with the government's approach to cooperate where we can, disagree where we must, and engage in the national interest, which is very similar to the EU triptych on China. But another important way we manage our interests in the face of challenges is working through friends and partners. And you rightly assumed I was going to talk about ASEAN. So in Southeast Asia, we place great value on our partnership with ASEAN and ASEAN centrality. Australia was ASEAN's first dialogue partner, which we commemorated at a special summit in Melbourne in March, and ASEAN's first comprehensive strategic partner. ASEAN has long understood the importance of collaboration, engagement and negotiation of differences to shape its region. And that's why we engage strongly with ASEAN and the ASEAN-centric institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum and the East Asia Summit. Also, a number of speakers talked about greater economic engagement across Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and we strongly support that, and we believe it boosts alignment in the region. IPEF was mentioned by Ambassador Kumar, RCEP, and the CPTPP. I remember I spent quite a few years of my life lobbying for the TPP on Capitol Hill in her former life, but anyway, and that's very important. The Australian government appointed a special envoy to Southeast Asia, Nick Moore, to develop an economic strategy to 2040 to boost Australian trade and investment, including in clean energy transition and infrastructure development. And we've made tangible progress on that agenda. Also in the Pacific, where we're, as Australian ministers have noted, we are engaged in a permanent contest. We work closely with Papua New Guinea, Fiji and others, and through the Pacific Islands Forum to ensure that Australia remains a partner of choice. Also to ensure that we support the Pacific as it faces the existential threat of climate change, and to ensure that we continue to support Pacific security in response to Pacific needs, such as through the recent Pacific Policing Initiative announced by Prime Minister Albanese at the Samoa Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. So we participate in a very wide array of partnerships and forums. A few other key partnerships, and this is not remotely a comprehensive list, but I have to mention these. New Zealand. Sometimes we're so close to New Zealand that we can forget to mention them, but it's absolutely vital. Our alliance and close partnership is sui generis. Our Closer Economic Relations Agreement is one of the most comprehensive free trade agreements in existence, almost a single market, and our defence forces work closely together as well. In Indonesia, we have strong ministerial engagement in both directions, including most recently with President Prabowo. Bilateral cooperation is extensive across multiple domains, and we've just concluded a new defence cooperation agreement. And as the Singaporean ambassador has just walked in, I should also mention that our foreign minister has just been in Singapore and has talked very enthusiastically about the work that we are doing with you. Other regional forums, we've mentioned the Quad, Australia, US, Japan and India. And it's very much focused on delivering positive, practical outcomes which respond to things the region needs. And some of you may recall the key impetus for the leaders level Quad process inaugurated in 2021, of which I was the Sherpa, was to use our collective efforts, including through Indian pharmaceutical companies, to scale up COVID vaccine production and distribution for countries in the region. And the Indian ambassador also mentioned the many other areas that we work on in the Quad. This work helps us shape the region by pooling resources and offering choices, as Ambassador Kumar also mentioned, and is part of our efforts to achieve strategic balance. Now, on the rules, sadly, rules and norms which underpin peace and stability are being challenged and tested, as you know. And in the Indo-Pacific, as elsewhere, things are becoming more unstable. With respect to China, its unprecedented and rapid military expansion lacks the transparency essential for strategic reassurance. And we feel that dialogue and open channels of communication are essential, which is one of the reasons we're engaged in all the processes I've just talked about. And so is standing up strongly for the rules that protect common interest, whether it be supporting UNCLOS and freedom of navigation, standing with Ukraine against its invasion by a permanent member of the Security Council in direct contravention of the UN Charter, and working to secure the best possible outcomes in UN and other multilateral forums. At a time when Australia's security environment has deteriorated sharply, part of our response, as we also see here in Europe, lies in deterrence and defence and developing military capability. As Deputy Prime Minister Miles said at the Shangri-La conference in June, the lesson of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that our agreements, treaties and alliances required hard power to back them up. Australia seeks, through our own national capabilities, alliances and regional architecture, to build a sustainable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, which constrains and ultimately precludes military options, by ensuring the risks of force outweigh any perceived benefit. Australia's investments in national defence capabilities, increasing spending to around 2.4% of GDP over the coming decade, is a prudent contribution to that balance, as is our enhanced force posture with the United States and our expanded defence cooperation with Japan, Korea, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam and other Southeast Asian partners, as is US force posture enhanced with some of these countries as well, and as is the enhanced military capability partnership under AUKUS between the US, UK and Australia to bolster our deterrence and defence. Firstly, through nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarines under Pillar 1, and through the development and delivery of advanced military capability under Pillar 2. I'd like to finish up my remarks, and I hope I haven't gone on too long, by mentioning the value of a European voice in Indo-Pacific affairs, and very much echo the comments made by Ambassador Kumar. And also engagement by NATO allies. Partly because we need to make common cause with other important states that share our commitment to the rules. Partly because European economic heft, and very much agree with what you said about global gateway and the way in which Europe can make a strong contribution in the region. And because, as Russia's war in Ukraine has shown us, strategic theatres are interconnected. How this war ends will matter to how others assess their own military options. And that's partly why Australia has stood very strongly with Ukraine and provided over, I think it's about 1.2 billion Australian dollars in military assistance. And what happens in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait and across the Indo-Pacific also affects all of us here in Europe. So building alignment has never been more important.